Tonight at 10, the Syrian city of Aleppo once again under heavy bombardment as the ceasefire collapses. It lasted less than a day as Syrian government forces attacked a handful of areas still in rebel hands.
Tens of shells are raining down on the besieged areas in Aleppo. There are injured in the field hospitals, injured as a result of the bombardment by the regime forces.
The evacuation of civilians is again delayed. The UN talks of war crimes being committed, but President Assad claims that the West is protecting terrorists.
Officials in the mainstream media, they're going to be worried about the civilians. They're not worried when the opposite happens, when the terrorists killing those civilians.
We'll have the latest on the plight of people in Aleppo amid reports that a new attempt will be made to evacuate them in the morning. Also tonight, a breakthrough in fertility science. We report on the woman who gave birth using tissue removed when she was a little girl. Paying for social care in England. The government is set to allow local authorities to bring forward planned rises in council tax. It's all change for school funding in England, with less money for big cities and more for rural and suburban areas. And how Iceland's volcanic energy could be harnessed to power tens of thousands of homes.
In the south, some progress at today's talks, but the misery for Southern Rail travellers continues, with further train strikes still on. Plus, how cutting nerves to her spine seems to have relieved Talia's cerebral palsy.
Good evening. The ceasefire agreed yesterday in the Syrian city of Aleppo has collapsed. The small part of eastern Aleppo, still in rebel hands, has been under renewed bombardment, and the evacuation of thousands of civilians has been delayed yet again. The UN says that the bombardment of civilians in Aleppo is probably a war crime. There are reports tonight that a new attempt will be made to evacuate people from Aleppo sometime in the morning. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, is following the events for us in Beirut.
A rare quiet became another day of war, shattering a ceasefire only hours after it started, and crushing a bit of hope that the agony of Aleppo was over, especially for those still trapped in what's left of their homes in the east of the city.
Oh my God. All the people were, let's say, psyched and happy with the agreement about leaving and evacuating the city, finally. And they were just preparing themselves, and they think that the regime is going to take ground for them.
Imagine what it's like for children without parents. Today, 47 orphans sent a message to the world.
Please let us evacuate Aleppo. We can't go outside because of the airstrikes and the shelling. We are afraid. We would really like you to help us leave Aleppo. We want to live like everyone else.
This morning, before first light, the buses, the ambulances did move in, ready to bring out the ill and the injured, the children, the fighters. But the first ambulance was turned back by a pro-government militia. And the buses waited for hours. More than 100,000 people escaped this hellish corner in recent weeks, fleeing under fire. A brutish existence, a victory just to survive. Many did not. The UN is now raising concern about alleged massacres of civilians, a grave accusation dismissed today by President Assad.
If we liberate Aleppo from the terrorists, there would be, the Western officials and the mainstream media, they're going to be worried about the civilians. They're not worried when the opposite happens, when the terrorists killing those civilians.
State TV shows what they say is the evidence. A weapons factory captured during the army's offensive. The rockets rebels have been firing into West Aleppo. It's why it's been so hard to reach a deal to let the fighters go.
All these crimes that they have committed, after all bombing the old city of Aleppo through explosive tunnels, robbing, looting factories, no one likes to see those. After killing 11,000 civilians in the western parts of Aleppo, no one likes to see them just go.
So the fight goes on. But there are reports a new deal is done, that rebels will leave, that an evacuation of civilians will at last happen, and that this brutal battle for Aleppo may, just may, be over. Lise Doucette, BBC News, Beirut.
Watching that with me is Jeremy Bowen, our Middle East editor. Suggestion there, Jeremy, of maybe a truce in the morning, but put this battle for us into the wider context.
It's the death throes of the rebel resistance in East Aleppo. It's not going to suddenly turn the tide there, and I think there may well be a few more problems before they get a deal. I think they will get a deal. There are things, some lines coming out. The top cleric of JFS, which is a jihadist group there, said, "Our surprise is still in the box. I advise the media not to sleep tonight." So, there's rhetoric flying around. In the wider sense, what's happened in Aleppo is not the end of the war, but it may well be the end of the dream a lot of people in the West have had, and also in countries like Saudi Arabia, of regime change in Syria, an Assad regime going. I think the war is now going to take a different kind of shape. Rebels still hold a lot of territory, so do the jihadists of Islamic State. But, it could be an insurgency strategy, could be more urban bombs, something like that. Certainly not peace. And also what is going to continue stirring the pot in a big way and prolonging the fight, I think, is the continued intervention in the country by major military powers, including the US, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the British as well are there. And a lot of those countries have bigger agendas than simply the agenda of Assad versus militias who exist only to destroy them. So there's going to be a bit of a rethink, I think. And also, don't forget, in America, the Trump administration coming in, and Assad, in that interview that was in Lisa's piece, said today, he offered an olive branch to Trump. He said, in the fight against the terrorists, as he calls them, Mr. Trump is a natural ally. So we'll see.
OK, Jeremy, thanks again. Jeremy Bowen there for us. Now, a major advance in fertility science has allowed a woman in London to give birth using frozen ovarian tissue, which had been removed when she was just 9 years old. Moza Al-Matroushi, whose son was delivered yesterday, told the BBC it was like a miracle, and doctors say it will give hope to other girls and young women whose fertility is under threat because of treatment that they've had for cancer or other diseases. She's been speaking exclusively to our medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
Every baby is special, but this little boy really is astonishing because he is the result of frozen ovarian tissue taken from his mum when she was just 9. Against the odds, Moza has become a mother.
It's something miracle that I have my baby now because it was so long, January, that we are waiting for this nice result.
As a child, Moza, who's from Dubai, had a serious blood disorder. She needed a bone marrow transplant, which would make her infertile. So prior to chemotherapy, she had her right ovary removed. Slices of ovarian tissue were taken, each containing follicles with immature eggs, which were frozen. 2 years ago, 4 were stitched onto her failed left ovary in transplant surgery in Denmark. Within months, she began ovulating and her premature menopause was reversed. Eggs were retrieved and used in IVF treatment.
Good morning, Mommy. Good morning.
Her doctor at the private Portland Hospital in London says this is a major advance in safeguarding women's fertility.
I'm absolutely overjoyed for this patient. It offers fantastic hope for a lot of children around the world who need life-threatening treatments for cancer or other major illnesses.
These are cow ovaries, but it's the same process involved in preparing human tissue for freezing.
We believe there are thousands of cases in storage across the world for tissue that has been preserved for young girls and young women who are likely to have lost their fertility as a result of chemotherapy treatment or radiation treatment.
When Moza had her ovarian tissue frozen in a tank of liquid nitrogen like this 15 years ago, when she was just 9 years old, it was a rare and pioneering procedure. Back then, some scientists thought the tissue would perish long before she'd want to start a family. Well, now she's shown what's possible and given hope to thousands. What message does your baby son send to young girls who may be going through cancer treatment now?
There is another chance and there is another hope, because my hope it was I have a nice child like this baby.
Moza says she hopes to have another child and is looking forward to going home to Dubai as soon as her son is old enough to fly.
Fergus Walsh there, our medical correspondent. Now, local authorities in England will be allowed to bring forward planned rises in council tax in order to pay for social care over the next 3 years. BBC News has been told it's unlikely there'll be any new money to avert a full-blown crisis in social care, and many councils, they say, are expected to struggle. Our home editor, Mark Easton, reports now from Manchester.
A brooding Manchester tower block challenges us all. What are you doing for the kind of people who live here, it seems to ask. An extra care housing project where many residents require some help with daily living. Whitebeck Court exemplifies a growing need.
OK, Betty, here's your tablets.
Thank you.
This scheme's budget's safe, but Manchester must find savings of £27 million from its adult social care provision. And even the Prime Minister accepts that in many parts of England, vital services are now under threat.
You're the only person that they see throughout the day, so they just want somebody to talk to, and when you rush in, because they've cut the time down, you don't get the time to spend and sit and talk.
They're lovely, my carers, every one of them.
How important, I mean, how would you be if they were to cut back on some of that service? They're not going to, incidentally, but just in...
I wouldn't like it, no. I rely on them.
This is not a new crisis. Politicians have been talking about the need for radical new thinking on how we fund adult social care in England for decades. But ministers of all administrations have failed to deliver on their many promises, and that litany of failure looks set to continue.
Tomorrow it's expected that local authorities will be told they can put up council taxes to fund desperately needed services for the elderly and other vulnerable adults. But it's not quite what it seems. Local authorities in England are currently allowed to add a 2% supplement to council tax bills for the next 3 years, money that can be used to plug some of the gaps in adult social care provision. The new plan is to let them increase council tax a bit more, a bit sooner, for instance by 3% for 2 years, but with nothing then in the following year. It's more flexibility, but crucially no real new money.
For every pound that has been taken out of adult social care, it has bubbled up into our acute hospital provision, as people are spending longer and longer in hospital instead of being able to go out with adequately funded care packages.
Greater Manchester's new combined authority now has control of health and social care budgets across the region and is trying to solve both the bed-blocking crisis and the shortage of high-quality adult social care by smashing traditional departmental silos.
What we are beginning to see is a reduction in the number of people, particularly vulnerable people, having to go into hospital. And we believe the reason for that is because the support that we're providing them out in the community is stopping them from falling into crisis as often.
The crisis in the care of vulnerable adults is not going to be solved by tweaks to council tax rates. Cuts to social care budgets vastly exceed the extra that local authorities are allowed to raise. The challenge from this Manchester tower block has yet to be answered. Mark Easton, BBC News, Manchester.
The unemployment rate has fallen again to 4.8%, and that is the lowest in a decade. New figures show that the unemployment number has fallen by 16,000 to 1.62 million. And the latest figures also show a small rise in average earnings, an increase of 2.5% in the year to October. Well, the government's plan for leaving the European Union won't be outlined until February at the earliest, according to the Brexit Secretary David Davis. He told MPs that there was a lot of work to be done before it was ready, and he signalled that a transitional deal will only be struck if it is seen to be necessary. Mr Davis also sought to reassure British firms and universities that their interests will not be harmed by migration controls after Britain leaves the EU.
The operation of that decision after we have left the European Union will be in the national interest, and that will affect all levels of skill. The judgment that the government comes to as to what's necessary for universities, what's necessary for business, and what's necessary for fruit picking.
David Davis speaking today. Let's join John Pienaar, our Deputy Political Editor at Westminster. Are we any the wiser, John, as to how this plan is shaping up?
Well, what the Brexit Secretary had to say today to that committee of MPs may give some small comfort to some businesses or university vice-chancellors, or for that matter fruit farmers, who are worried that British migration control after Brexit may cause the supply of people they say they need to dry up. David Davis was saying that the desire to control migration wouldn't be allowed to harm Britain's practical needs. But even so, it's not clear over maybe 18 months or more of negotiations whether Brussels will allow Britain to control migration in this way and still have full and free access to European markets. They may still argue that Britain wants to have its cake and eat it. Now today, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, was confident that the negotiation could, to all intents and purposes, be tied up in the space of maybe 18 months. But what the final deal looks like, well, he didn't know, Hugh, and frankly, nor does anyone else.
OK, John, thanks very much again. John Pienaar there with the latest for us at Westminster. Now, President Obama has cancelled some arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the Saudis' conduct in the war in Yemen. There's growing concern about civilian casualties in airstrikes led by the Saudis against rebel forces in Yemen. And the decision follows an investigation into the Saudi bombing of a funeral in October when they used American weapons, killing 140 people and injuring hundreds. BBC Arabic's Nawal Al-Makafi reports now from Sana'a, the capital of Yemen.
This is the site of the deadliest attack in Yemen's 21-month war. A community hall in the heart of the capital city, Sana'a. On the 8th of October, thousands of Yemenis were making their way here to mourn the loss of a respected tribal leader. His funeral had been widely advertised. Many civilians came to pay their respects, and some rebel government leaders. At the height of the funeral, the building was bombed by a coalition warplane. A 500-pound American-made bomb crashed through the roof and exploded, causing utter devastation. 14-year-old Hussein was caught in the explosion. Hussein's leg was trapped in the rubble. Desperate to get out, Hussein and his father drew their daggers to cut it off. The decision saved his life. The first airstrike dropped right over here. And as people were running out of the windows and the first responders were coming in to treat the casualties, around 6 to 7 minutes later, the second airstrike dropped over here. 2 airstrikes on the same target with a gap of minutes between them is known as a double tap. This can be classified as a war crime. White House officials expressed immediate concern, warning that security cooperation with Saudi Arabia was not a blank check. The United States government has been the Saudi-led coalition's strongest backer, providing intelligence, advisory, and logistical support, including mid-air refueling.
I have no doubt in my mind.
Recently retired Ambassador Jerry Firestein worked with the State Department and was dealing with the Yemen war for more than a year.
We are not actively engaged in supporting the government of Saudi Arabia or the Saudi military in carrying out these actions.
But you're refueling the plane. First of all, you're providing them with the planes, you're providing them with the bombs, you're providing them with advice, and you're refueling the very planes that are committing or that are said to be committing alleged war crimes. So does that not make the American government complicit if there are war crimes being committed?
Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think so.
But US Congressman and lawyer Ted Lieu believes his government has to change its policy in cooperating with Saudi Arabia.
If you look at the law of war and international law, you can be guilty of aiding and abetting war crimes. So if you're in that direct military operation, refueling a jet that then commits a war crime, my view is that opens up the United States to great risk, and we need to stop doing it.
The Saudi-led coalition claims that the plane that carried out the funeral attack was directed by the Yemenis without their knowledge, but it's still under investigation. But so far, over 10,000 people have been killed, millions have lost their homes, and there is no end in sight in this war. Nawal al-Makhafi, BBC News, Yemen.
And you can see more of Nawal's reporting from Yemen in the Our World documentary. It's called The Funeral Bombing. It's on this Saturday and Sunday on the BBC News channels at 9:30 at night. And, of course, you can catch it on the BBC iPlayer. Let's have a quick look at some of the day's other news stories then. British Airways cabin crew have voted overwhelmingly in favour of strike action in a dispute over pay. The Unite union says members have rejected a pay rise of 2%, and the strike dates are not yet known, but they could start in a week's time. Talks to resolve the long-running dispute at Southern Rail have been adjourned until tomorrow. A 48-hour strike by the drivers' union ASLEF ends at midnight, with another stoppage due on Friday. The union said that today's meeting at the Conciliation Service ACAS was positive. Southern says that services tomorrow will still be severely disrupted. A former football coach for Crewe Alexandra's youth team has appeared before magistrates charged with child sex offences dating back to the early 1980s. Barry Burnell was ordered to remain in custody until next month, when he'll appear at Crown Court, as our sports editor Dan Rowan tells us.
A successful former coach in the 1980s, Barry Burnell worked with some of the most promising young footballers in the northwest of England. Youth team coach at Crewe Alexandra, he also had links with Manchester City and Stoke City. This is Burnell speaking to the BBC when at Crewe.
We do a lot of talking to, as well as showing them their skills and explaining the game to them. But we explain that there's more to it than just coming here 1 hour a week. They need to, well, we give them homework.
Today at South Cheshire Magistrates Court in Crewe, Burnell was charged with 8 historic child sex offences. Appearing via video link and looking thin and frail, the 62-year-old wore a blue jumper and sat with his arms folded during the 14-minute hearing. He spoke only to confirm his name, date of birth and address, given as no fixed abode. Burnell faced 5 counts of indecent assault, 2 counts of inciting the victim to commit an act of gross indecency, and 1 count of assault with intent to commit buggery. All the alleged offences are said to have happened between 1981 and 1985, when the alleged victim was under the age of 15. Burnell did not enter a plea and was remanded in custody. This comes at a time when British football tries to cope with a rising number of historic child sex abuse allegations. More than 20 police forces have confirmed they're investigating, with 83 potential suspects and around 100 clubs involved. Burnell, meanwhile, is scheduled to appear at Chester Crown Court on January the 11th. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Crewe. Now, the US Federal Reserve, America's central bank, has raised its key interest rate by 0.25%. It's only the second increase in a decade. The bank said the decision had been taken because of a stronger US economy, but then it still stressed that the outlook was still uncertain. Our North America business correspondent Michelle Fleury is in Washington. Michelle, some more thoughts on what's gone behind this decision and what it tells us about the year ahead?
Well, Hugh, it's a vote of confidence in the US economy. As you mentioned, this is only the second rate rise in nearly a decade. Cast your minds back to 2009. The unemployment rate back then, in the wake of the financial crisis, was at 10%. Today, the Labour picture is much improved. The unemployment rate is now at 4.6%. That's near full employment, giving the Fed, the building behind me, the policymakers inside there, the reassurance they needed to act now. The key question going forward is how they will react to the incoming Trump administration. Donald Trump has talked about tax cuts. He's talked about spending on infrastructure. He wants to boost spending on defense. All of these initiatives could boost growth, but they could also boost inflation. And that has some people saying that the Federal Reserve may need to raise rates faster going forward. That could put Fed Chair Janet Yellen on a collision course with Donald Trump.
Michelle, thanks very much for the latest on that interest rate rise in Washington. Michelle Fleury. The biggest reform of school funding seen for many years in England will channel less money to big cities and more to schools in rural and suburban areas. The Education Secretary, Justine Greening, said that the new national funding formula for England would resolve unfair and inconsistent funding levels. Our education editor, Bramwell Jeffries, has more details.
For schools today, a reminder that geography matters. Tuxford Academy is in Nottinghamshire, a county that's campaigned for a new funding deal for schools. Today, they said a little extra money for each pupil would make a big difference.
So if you translate that times 1,700 children, you're talking as much as £1 million to £1.5 million difference. That is a significant number of extra teachers, a significant number of extra support staff.
At the moment, schools in the county of Nottinghamshire get about £4,300 per pupil each year in basic funding. But schools in the city of Nottingham get £5,300 per pupil. It's one of the best funded areas outside London. Under the new formula, the goalposts will shift. 10,000 schools are expected to gain a bigger share. To make that happen, some schools will lose up to 3% per pupil of funding. The idea is to reduce a funding gap that's grown bigger over the years.
What's been created over time is a funding system that allows similar schools with similar students to receive levels of funding so different that they put some young people at an educational disadvantage.
The bottom line for schools is that the cake just isn't getting any bigger, no matter how you slice it. So even in areas where they hope to do better under this new funding formula, there will still have to be very significant savings.
Around 10,000 schools serving over 2 million children will be losing money. In a period where pupil numbers and inflation is rising in tandem, the pressure on school budgets will continue to increase.
Under these changes, money will move. Rural areas gain, the cities lose out.
Your lesson objective today.
Parents at Ellis Guildford paid £40 this year towards laptops. In this deprived part of Nottingham, that's a big contribution. This school thinks it might end up with bigger classes and
you're going to be looking at some of those additional support personnel perhaps not being able to be funded. And I think that would be a really, really difficult situation for some of our youngsters who do have extremely challenging lives and backgrounds.
Financial pressures in school budgets stretch beyond England. Every part of the UK is grappling with how best to allocate money. These changes make life a little harder for some English schools, a little easier for others. Bramwell Jeffries, BBC News, Nottinghamshire.
Scientists in Iceland are working on a project to harness the immense energy of a volcano to provide power for tens of thousands of homes. They've drilled to a depth of nearly 3 miles, where temperatures reach 500 degrees Celsius, where they plan to access a vast subterranean reservoir. Our science correspondent, Rebecca Morell, has this exclusive report from Iceland.
This is one of the most volcanically active places on Earth. But now scientists plan to harness the power of volcanoes by drilling into the heart of one. This site's been operating continuously for 24 hours a day, using this huge piece of kit. With section after section of high-strength steel, they're almost 5,000 metres down.
We have never been this deep before. We have never been into this hot rock formations before. So we are optimistic that this will carry us a step into the future.
So exactly what is it they're doing here?
This project's been planned for years. It's going to be the hottest borehole in the world. The drilling started back in August, beginning its descent deep underground. It's already passed through thick layers of volcanic rock, and at 2,500 metres, it hit 300 degrees Celsius. This is the point that most conventional boreholes stop, but this one's gone deeper. Heading towards 5,000 metres down, that's 3 miles, where it's expected to hit 500 degrees.
Here, water mixes with molten rock and becomes what's known as supercritical steam. It's neither a liquid nor a gas, but it holds far more energy than either. And it's this that's going to be brought back up to the surface. Scientists think it will generate so much electricity, it could transform the energy industry.
But a project like this isn't risk-free. This is what happened in 2009 during an earlier attempt to tap into a volcano. The drill unexpectedly hit magma and was destroyed.
The most recent eruption here occurred 700 years ago.
Geologists say we've still got a lot to learn about these forces of nature.
Well, there is always some risk, and that has to be evaluated. But there is also a risk if we do not understand the volcanoes. In some other cases, like in Italy and elsewhere in the world, we have millions of people living on a volcano, and in order to advance our understanding of when these volcanoes will erupt, we need to go and see what is down there.
In Iceland, towns are already using energy generated from volcanoes, but this new approach could create up to 10 times more electricity. And if it works, this technology and the energy it harnesses could be used around the world. Rebecca Morrell, BBC News, Iceland.
Before we go, we are getting some reports from the internet company Yahoo, which is saying that hackers have stolen data from more than 1 billion of its accounts. And in a statement, Yahoo saying in the past few minutes that the stolen data may have included names and email addresses, telephone numbers, dates of birth and passwords. That's all I have at the moment, but of course we will be updating you on that story on the BBC News channel throughout the night. But here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.